Good afternoon, everyone, and welcome to this inaugurational lecture of our 2025-2026 Global Lawmaking course. As you know, today we will be speaking about the regulation of the future, focusing on the emerging challenges of global lawmaking. We decided to cover this topic because we all know that the law is not longer what it used to be. The world has changed and continues to change, and the law must evolve accordingly. The real challenge, however, is that the world is not always changing for the better, and unfortunately we see that every day, and the law too may change for the worse instead of changing for the better. See, for example, the recent attacks to the legal response to climate change. See, for instance, the attempts to stall European Union regulation on the digital of the AI Act. Just this morning, Apple, for instance, attacked the European Union regulation demanding the Digital Market Act to be eliminated. So on the contrary, well, or maybe I think that regulation is more essential today than ever. It is important to manage risks, to manage concentration of power, violation of rights. Yet we also need to explore new legal forms capable of addressing these emerging challenges. Law must be renewed in order not to hinder progress, in order to avoid too much red tape and so forth and so on. We must search for new ways and new tools to build a law that is open to the innovation of science, that is responsive to the growing diversity of our societies, that is capable of adapting to new challenges rather than remaining static. We need a law able to combine certainty and predictability with, let me tell, the humility to face today's uncertainty. A law that can orient and govern new technology, not only by addressing and mitigating the risks they bring, the risk for the environment, the risk for fundamental rights, for equality, but also by boosting scientific research and technological development. This is the broad horizon against which we will like to discuss today this topic, also focusing in the second part of the talk to the regulatory sandbox. Regulatory sandbox as a kind of laboratory for the future of the law, maybe, where innovation and regulation meet and where law maybe can strike a balance between opportunity and responsibility. In order to do that, we have the real privilege to have a distinguished speaker today with us to guide us in this discussion, Professor Sofia Ranchordás, if the pronunciation is more or less correct. She's a full professor of administrative law at Tilburg Law School. She's also professor of public law, innovation and sustainability at Luis Guido Carli in Rome. She studied and published on a number of different issues: administrative law, vulnerability and vulnerabilities, interactions between citizens and government, law of AI, the digital perspective and stuff. She published also a lot with very prestigious editors like Oxford University Press, Cambridge University Press. For instance, this morning we presented her latest book, Introduction to Law and Regulation, published with Cambridge University Press, right? Okay, so, she deals actually a lot with global law, with a comparative and very innovative and interdisciplinary perspective. And so I think that we could not have a better speaker for the inauguration of this course this year. So, Sofia, thank you so much for being with us, and you have the floor.
Yeah, thank you very much, Carlo. So welcome, everybody. It's actually my great pleasure to be here. And I'll start with a little story because we are in a courthouse. And this really brought me back to being a student, almost a student again. Because when I left, I graduated from law school, I actually worked as a lawyer, a practicing lawyer, and I have never entered the courthouse. I had been once to a courthouse for mediation, but I never a real courthouse. So, but I had watched a lot of American movies and series, right? So I thought, I thought, well, that's all courthouses look the same. So let me tell you, yes, this courthouse might seem normal to you, but I was born in Portugal. I did my first graduate degree in Portugal, and courthouses in Portugal do not look like this. So they definitely have those benches. They have some rows, and then they have side benches. And then I enter through the door with my, with my gown, and I saw that the defendant was sitting there. So I thought, like the American movies, you sit next to your defendant, right, with your clients. So I sat next to my client and started conferring with him. This was a pro bono case, by the way. And then I see, another lawyer that actually comes and sees me. And then she sits also behind me with her defendant. And so suddenly I realized that all the other lawyers, they were not sitting where we were sitting. They started sitting on the side benches next to the prosecutors. And I thought that was really weird because why would you sit next to the prosecutors, right? Well, turns out that actually, in Portugal, you don't sit next to your defendants because all the defendants in these kind of pro bono cases, they all sit together and the lawyers have to sit separately. So basically, there was a more senior lawyer that came to me and said, look, I don't think you're sitting, unless you are being trialed for something, I don't think you are sitting in the right place. So that's where you sit. And that was really embarrassing. I felt really young, really, really young. I felt really bad. So that was not that was my experience. I think I did not enter any other courthouse since then because I was working on in competition law. So then you never go to the court. You always do mostly go to competition authority. So that was it for me, but that was my experience. So every time I enter this kind of setting, it brings me back to that day that I was really ashamed, when I was really, really embarrassed. So courts have not changed much. They're still the same, even though there are some moot courses, some places where they try to project avatars and make it more modern. But basically the reason why I'm telling the story is that sometimes, in order to understand the future, you need to actually look at the past a little bit. And I think this is actually important not only to understand why courthouses are designed the way they are, because there's the reason why we have this kind of disposition and why other countries do not have the same disposition. It definitely shows a narrative of hierarchies and understanding of what the position is of people, separation of powers. There is always a reason why. And so I think it's important to always think about that, even when we are discussing AI or any other novel topics. The future is very often answered by looking at the past. But because I did to prepare for this lecture, I thought, well, before I look into the past, let me ask the future or the present what it would be to regulate the future. So I asked ChatGPT, as one does nowadays, because Carlo gave me gave me the challenge of giving a lecture on how to regulate the future. He decided the title, and I was like, sounds challenging, regulation of the future. So I wrote on ChatGPT, how do you regulate the future? And ChatGPT said, this is a profound question. And gave me actually some ideas. So basically, it said it can mean different things in law, ethics, technology. And then it talked about some of the things I was already supposed to talk about. So it wasn't that inaccurate because ChatGPT told me that I should talk about anticipatory regulation. biotech, which really connects to what, Carlos' group does, see? So you work on the future. Principle-based frameworks, and no doubt, these act as North Stars to guide future decision-making. Yeah? So it's, and then experimental governance. And I actually did my PhD on experimental governance. So I was very happy to see that. I was already regulating the future with my work, 10 years ago. And then they talked about, they also mentioned intergenerational justice. So considering also climate change, environmental regulation, so all these elements. So there is indeed some truth to what ChatGPT said, but as ChatGPT acknowledged itself, it is a profound question to regulate the future. And I do think that what ChatGPT does, and actually not only ChatGPT, in general, there is this tendency that when we want to regulate complex things, or we want to anticipate things, we want to predict things that are very, very complex, this is something that we humans are not very good at. We don't really like it. It makes us nervous. So basically what we try to do is to simplify. We like numbers. Nothing gives us more certainty than numbers. And what is really funny is that this is a tendency that has existed for a long time, because simplification is basically what we have always done. The church has simplified messages in order to make them more simple, especially after the Reformation. Before the Reformation, people would talk in Latin, and then basically nobody would understand. And that was a way of basically hiding messages as well, because then if nobody understands, you have to invent for yourself what things are meant. From the moment that you start simplifying or translating messages coming to the public, of course, this is a way to actually change things. But true simplification and actually using numbers to simplify messages and complexity is something a little bit recent. In fact, when I read this book that I highly recommend, Trust in Numbers, it's a book by Theodore Porter. And basically, Theodore Porter, an American scientist, he actually wrote this book where he talks about simplification by numbers using different case studies. And one of them is actually a case study that is actually used from the early 20th century. There was actually a French technique of engineers that in order to calculate whether there would be floods, they actually came up with these measurements. And these measurements were only to measure water levels. And it makes sense because it's just whether the water is higher or lower. And these engineers, they were quite effective at predicting the rise of the tide and how that would impact the population. So if you go to Florence, for example, you see that in the river, sometimes there are these marks of where the river goes up to. And this has been an old thing in countries or cities that had problems with water. Also in the Netherlands, only that the Dutch like to steal the water, like to steal earth, the ground from the sea. So they're basically undermining the sea all the time. And basically, what he says is that nowadays in regulation, when we want to regulate the present or the future, we are thinking from this engineering perspective of simplifying everything to numbers in order to predict how things will be. And basically, a lot of the mechanisms, which I'm not going to bother you with, like cost-benefit analysis, which is basically to decide on whether you regulate or not based on the balance between cost and benefits, they are still based on this idea of the French engineers. They would calculate if there were going to be floods or not. But the problem is, our reality is extremely complex. Not everything is a bit whether the water will be higher or the water will be lower. And when the reality is so complex, how do you regulate by numbers? So especially with technology. So for example, another book that you can read in English, by the way, it's translated. It's this book, which is also a big Bible of technology by Alain Suppiot, which is also governance by numbers. And in French, for example, you don't say digital law. You don't say digital. When you refer to the digital world, you say numérique, so the numbers. And so basically, the idea is everything that is digital is reduced to numbers, which basically kind of makes sense. Because when you think of coding, when you think of automating information, very often it's about this element of numbers. But then again, when you know about ChatGPT, you know that nowadays our technology can no longer be reduced by numbers. It's really, we have moved way beyond this kind of calculus. It has become really, really complex to reduce things to numbers. So basically, we're still at the question, how are we going to regulate the future? I mean, reducing it to numbers is very complex. So we basically need to think about the bigger questions that are involved in regulating the present and the future. So basically, I was going to dig into the future right away, but Kyle told me like this morning, why don't you talk about the past a little bit? Because this morning I talked about the past of regulation. And he said, I think it would be good to reflect upon the past, because the past tells us so much about how we are living today. So then I said, well, let's talk about the past of regulation, because the past of regulation is important to help us understand how we will regulate for the future. So I recently published a book with Karen Young called Introduction to Law and Regulation. And basically, what fascinates me about regulation is that regulation is a bit of a core exercise of lawyers in a way, because lawyers love to control things. They are a little bit control freaks. And regulation, in a way, is a way of exercising power over what we can't control, but also it's regulation is also a way of subjecting to our power what we cannot control. And this is something that we really see with technology. We cannot always control technology, but we can regulate it so it's under our power, or at least we hope so. So when did this start? When did we start to actually want to regulate in this way? When I started studying regulation many years ago, back when I thought I had to sit there, this was actually the image that I'll think about. I know there are some American students here. That's true. So you know this image. Yeah? What is the context of this image? The Great Depression, exactly. So this is actually like a very famous picture from the Great Depression. Actually, this woman is younger than me in reality, even though like you can see she looks much older because of famine and stress and everything. But this is a very famous picture from the Great Depression. And even though regulation was born a little bit before the Great Depression, it was born with the creation of the ICC and with the Sherman Act. The reality is that the regulation as we know it now, as something that is megalomanous, that regulates every single part of our life, was actually born mostly with the New Deal, which was a response to the Great Depression. And when I tell my students about regulation, I always tell them regulation is cyclical. If you want to know what's going to happen next in our future, we need to actually see the cycles and how the cycles have evolved. And there was a moment in history where to respond to actually like this huge global crisis, the decision was to regulate everything. And the New Deal was basically one of the biggest programs of regulation ever, probably the biggest, which entailed to regulate left and right and to actually create a bunch of new agencies on, like financial regulation, from financial regulation to food and drug. I mean, it was everything. It was also the way to codify, administrative law, even though this actually happened after Roosevelt passed away. So when we really want to look at the bigger picture of regulation, the one that we still have nowadays, the one that reflects this need to regulate everything, but also the need to simplify things with numbers, we need to find its origins in the New Deal. Because it was actually here that the seed was planted to actually think about that. So for example, the Hoover Dam, which was one of the biggest constructions in that period, was also designed according to this French engineering model where you calculate whether you need it or not. Of course, after the New Deal, which I think is like, something that should be studied like in every course of administrative law because it was so impactful, then we had the big period of implementing all this regulation. But, this happened until the 70s. Because basically in the 70s, there was this idea that regulation had exploded. And there was, I would say a president that was very much, 70s and 80s, there was one specific president that was very much keen on underlying like this element of explosion of regulation. Does anybody know who that was? A very big opposer of regulation. Exactly. Exactly. So Reagan, as because you study history of the United States, Reagan used to be an actor, and he always had jokes. So he basically had a drawer, like in the Oval Office, he had a drawer full of jokes, because then every time he would come up with a joke, he would write it down, and then he could always use a joke when he remembered. And so he would come up with these jokes, and these jokes were often about, about the government, how big the government had become. It was always about criticizing the government, because this was the position he had. And the thing is, the criticism of government came very much because in the 70s, it was another big global crisis, which was, like, I don't know if you study this, you're very young to know about it, but why did Reagan get so much support in this period? There was something that is very similar to what's happening now. There was a part of the world that was a bit unstable in the 70s. Environmental, unfortunately, they didn't talk about that in the 70s. They should have, because this is when they created them. Exactly. There was the oil crisis. Because of the instability in the Middle East, there was the oil crisis in this period. So basically, there was actually some room for, for reforming the system, because the country was in crisis. I mean, the whole world actually entered like a period of depression because of the oil shortages. Because when you don't have oil, you cannot actually run the economy we have today, because plastic is made of oil. Basically, everything a lot of the things we have in this room would actually not be able to produce, or even clothes. So in that sense, this became a big problem. And it was in this period of crisis that not only Reagan, but also Thatcher in the UK started actually pushing towards the deregulatory state. So while we before, until this period, had regulated a lot, we also had created the welfare state, especially like in the US was with Johnson, and different acts that were adopted. And in Europe, it was, mostly due to the Beveridge reports. But in the 70s and 80s, there was this movement to deregulate, idea of like the government should shrink. And this was a movement where you actually saw like big changes, where there was the outsourcing of public tasks to the private sector, closing of mines, for example, in the UK, which was very controversial. And basically, this was a big shift to to our perception of what the state should do. So the state should actually do less. And this was something that really changed the way in which we look at the state, and also had an impact on how the state actually treats its citizens. And again, this was something that was contested. In some countries, there was a bit of a re-regulation period in the 90s. In other countries, the American influence came later, so the deregulation continued. But there was a big accident that happened in the 80s that really woke us all up from the problem of not implementing regulation well. And none of you were born in that period, but what was that big accident, very dangerous accident that happened in the 80s? Big risks. Exactly. Chernobyl happens. Chernobyl was actually the first one. And then we had, after Chernobyl, we had, of course, the big oil. We have had several oil spills over the last years. But Chernobyl was one that impacted so many countries that it was a wake-up call for people. I was like, oh, we have to manage risks better. And it was actually in this period that idea of like not only intervening in the economy to regulate efficiency. It was, at this point, people think, well, we need to also regulate risks, because if we don't regulate risks, we are in trouble. And this was a bit of a wake-up call for a while. It wasn't enough, though, because while we started regulating more nuclear energy, and also like banning nuclear energy, there were many sectors in which people didn't even think there were problems. So the risks in the financial sector remains quite unregulated in some places. So basically, the regulatory world got another wake-up call in 2008 when apparently this is my step, so sorry, I got like a thing. So basically, in 2008, we had the global financial crisis. So I am like a daughter of the global financial crisis, because I graduated exactly in 2007. And it was impossible to find jobs, like actually 2008. So in 2008, when I was looking for a job, it was really, really hard. So for me and my friends, so for my group, almost everybody had to migrate, had to go somewhere. I went to the Netherlands, for example. So it was really hard for us. And this had to do with the fact that for many years, banks were allowed to speculate, and they were allowed to actually sell mortgages that were just not adequate. Of course, then if you look very, there is if you're interested in knowing more about this, there is a very interesting book by an American scholar called How the Other Half Banks. And it's actually a book about the banking system in the US and how actually part of the reason why there was this financial crisis had to do with the racial system of banking. Because basically in the US, there was a division that if you like in old days, Italians could not bank where the Irish banked. So there was the Bank of America, actually it used to be called the Bank of Italy. I don't know if you know that. Now it's one of the biggest American banks. It was the Bank of Italy. And there were banks for African American, citizens, and there were banks for basically all the groups. And at some point, this was banned, and so everybody had to bank in the same way. And this was regarded as an anti-discrimination measure, but in reality, it discriminated more because basically, like there was also the system of credit scoring. There was a system of, of course, like if parents were rich, it was easier to actually get credit. So there was a big history that was not accounted for. And this also contributed a lot to how the financial system developed. And I'm not going to spare it to bore you with details, but there is a racial discrimination element in regulation that very often people don't know about, but actually really contributed to the crisis we had in the US and the failure of banks in this period. So basically, with this other wake-up call, we really realized that we have to take risk really seriously. And basically, when I was working on the book on regulation, me and my co-author, we thought, okay, there are clearly ways in which you have to think about regulation. The traditional way is you regulate because you want to intervene in the economy. You want to address market failures. That's the first traditional way of looking at it. Address market failures. That's how economists think. Neoclassical economists, of course. You regulate because you want to manage risks. This is how sociologists think. And nowadays, if you look at the AI Act, also lawyers have embraced this perspective. But I think there is a third way of looking at it. Because basically, when you regulate, you also need to regulate to address inequities. Because basically, when you think of technology, there are a lot of inequities. There are a lot of advantages when it comes to technology, but they're not being distributed equally. The same with, if you think of climate change is happening and is being affecting mostly people that are, living in, global South. It's affecting people that are the poorest. So basically, I recently wrote a book on structural inequalities where I analyzed waste dumping. And waste dumping all around the world, and this is, dumping of nuclear toxic waste happens all around the world where poor people live. Either we talk in Italy, in the US. So for example, like in the US, you have the Louisiana Cancer Alley, which is quite famous, where basically you have petrochemical companies that basically have polluted the area. A lot of people develop cancer in that area. And it's not the only part in the US where you have it. In Europe, you also have cancer alleys. You have cancer alleys a bit everywhere. The common element between all of them is that the residents of the area were traditionally people of lower income. They usually you don't go dump your waste or build petrochemical companies in capitals. Usually it doesn't happen. And this is something that is quite common. The benefit of the extraction, it does not go to the people that are actually contributing the most and they're suffering the most. It goes to others in other parts of the world or other parts of the country even. And so, for example, before so I live between the Netherlands and Italy. And when I was living in the northern part of the Netherlands, which is a rich country, I know that was a very wealthy country, but north of the Netherlands was the reason why they became rich, because we have actually natural gas in the north of the Netherlands. We have a lot of natural gas. And basically, when Shell found out about natural gas, they started fracking it. They started fracking natural gas, and the country became rich thanks to that, because they became independent from other countries for a few decades. The issue is that Shell knew that fracking would actually cause earthquakes, because it does. If it's done poorly, it can cause earthquakes. So in Groningen, in the area of Groningen, over a period of 10 years, they started having earthquakes. And basically the houses started getting destroyed. people were like, were really affected. But then for a long time, there was the discussion of what to do. And it was only after like it really became a big thing that they decided to stop, the gas exploitation. But it was like after like years and years of damaging the area. And there are still political parties that think that they should go back to getting the gas out of that area and just say, well, we need to sacrifice some people. We sacrifice them because, they are farmers, so they are people that don't matter as much. So you have this everywhere. And you have this problem that regulation very often does not consider this inequity dimension. If you think of the future and you think of technology, you also see there's also an area of technology where you have what the narrative of inequity is very strong. And now we turn to the future. So for example, when you use social media, you know that very often the videos you get to see have been vetted before, in the sense that there is content moderation. Who does content moderation to make sure that you don't get to see horrible videos of animals being hurt, for example, children being hurt? Who does content moderation? Is it just algorithms? Private companies? And who do they hire to do this?
That's some hired currently.
Are they based in the US? That would be very expensive, no? That would be very expensive if they would be all based in the US. There are some that are based in the US, but it's a lot of work because it's millions of videos, because there are billions, like there's more than 1 billion people on Facebook. So it's impossible to pay US salaries. Most people are based in Venezuela, in Kenya, and many other countries. And this is basically the work of, it's called like a data annotation or data coding. And this is a work that's being done by very low paid workers in low income countries. And this has become a huge problem because in Kenya, for example, like there are people that they're constantly being exposed to like violence, because if you have to actually like vet these videos, you have to watch them. So imagine spending your whole day watching videos of animals being decapitated, of children being decapitated, of child pornography. So there are people who actually are exposed to that. And this is a huge problem nowadays, because this is an extractive practice that is basically being done in low-income countries, usually English-speaking countries, because of the colonial tradition. And unfortunately, this is a place, like an area which I wished AI was being used for, because AI would save us, would spare so much us humans. But unfortunately, AI isn't always as good as we are at detecting, certain things. So basically, these extractive practices of inequity, they continue nowadays in many ways. And this is actually like the reason why when we talk about the future, what's going on technology regulation, we need to think about all the extractive practices that happened in the past. So regulation also started because during imperial time, colonial times, we also had extraction of rubber. We had the extraction of minerals, gold and everything. And now we have the extraction of cobalt and all the other minerals we need to make electrical, batteries for our phones and our computers and the cars. And basically, we still have this dynamic where basically we are exploiting others to actually get the benefits. And this imperial, perspective is not my opinion. I'm not talking about this because it's my opinion. There is data on this. There is enough data showing this. Actually, there is a movie that I haven't watched yet, but it's a movie about data coders in India. It's called Humans in the Loop, which is about exactly the problem of exploiting low-income workers to annotate data. And basically, I think when we talk about regulating the future, we need to think about this. So my first point on regulating the future, besides what ChatGPT said, is to actually think about the unequal distribution of the benefits of technology. But I don't want to like have just a sad note to this inaugural lecture. I think it should be positive. So basically, besides the inequity element, I think we should also talk about more the economic perspective. Because basically, when we talk about the economic perspective, there have been like ways to actually not only focus on, the part of inequality, but to try to devise solutions to make us more competitive and also to promote responsible and green innovation. So last year, the Draghi report, it was issued in Europe. It was issued by the European Commission. And Mario Draghi wrote this report together with a team of economists and other scientists to actually try to rethink how we are basically working on competitiveness and how Europe should actually do a little bit better to actually compete with the rest of the world. So basically, the critique of Draghi was also like in the way in which Europeans innovate, that the Europeans are still to focus on the past. We need to actually like be a little bit more, embrace a little bit better our innovative potential. So among the many recommendations that his team gave, it was also the transition from basically just, innovation to decarbonization, and basically to, think of different ways in which, companies, especially small companies, could actually have access to better investment, to better compliance techniques. And in this way, he left quite a lot of, guidance to help us regulate the future. One of the elements he also mentioned was actually the need to collaborate, be more collaborative. And this is basically help us to actually, go to like more specific solutions that I'd like to discuss with you. And this will be like mostly like the focus of this, my last element of the talk. So when we actually want to like think about how we can actually regulate the future, in a way, we can of course look at the past to understand where we have failed in terms of like, practices. And one of the elements in which we have failed is we have done a lot of things top down, without any kind of collaboration, without any kind of like experimentation. So basically, one of the new approaches of regulation has been to actually try to be a little bit more innovation friendly, but also more collaborative. So instead of actually thinking about, we need to like keep up with innovation, we need to actually like, define innovation, have a different mindset. We also can do that if we actually are more collaborative. And a way of being collaborative, if we look at recent documents of the European Commission, is to actually embrace experimental approaches. And ChatGPT was right, because ChatGPT mentioned experimental approaches and mentioned sandboxes. So ChatGPT was, very much onto the point. So basically, sandboxes are a way of actually being more innovative, of working together with different parties. And I would like to talk to you about that, about sandboxes. I'll just skip a few slides because they're a little bit boring. So I'll just focus on the part on sandboxes. So basically, as I told you, to regulate well is to collaborate. Instead of just having a top-down approach like we have in the New Deal, we need to actually understand the different stakeholders' needs to also to ensure that the benefits are distributed among people, not that they just go to the Silicon Valley and then everybody else who is annotating data is just, suffering like from psychological damage of annotating data. So it's important to actually think about how we can work together. This involves, of course, a paradigm shift, because it means that we have to anticipate what we're going to regulate, we have to think about different measures, and we have to maybe adapt a little bit our regulatory approach to innovation. So when I think about anticipating, about adopting like an anticipatory regulation, it means we actually have to think of like learning. So you have to see the process of regulation as a learning process, as an iterative process, where we basically think of the outcomes mostly, and we try to experiment. This is not super easy to do in practice. You have to like really plan it carefully. So you need to basically devise a kind of methodology to do it. You need to make sure it's feasible. And for example, in the case of sandboxes, you need to have a sandbox plan, as it's called. Within this anticipatory approach, I would say that the most tangible way of doing it is, has been really devised nowadays with a sandbox plan. Does anybody know what a sandbox is, a regulatory sandbox? What do you think we can do in a sandbox? Thinking of a sandbox, it's just a sandbox. When you were kids, you played in the sandbox, right? Yeah, so this is basically an idea, sandbox. So basically, the idea of sandbox is, of course, to sandbox, So basically, first of all, the idea is you are in a sandbox, so you are isolated from the rest of the park. You play with your friends. You play under supervision because it's what you did when you were a kid, right? Your parents were watching you in a way, and you cannot get hurt, right? You're playing the sandbox. So very often when you go, like you have the slides and then you fall on the sand, so you don't get hurt. So a sandbox is, has a similar concept. It's a test bed to actually try out new things. It is a test bed where you can actually work with other companies, your friends, or not friends, competitors. And the idea is that you have to be small, like this child. You cannot be too big, otherwise you don't enter the sandbox. So it's actually for small actors that actually get to play in the sandbox under the supervision of their parents. In this case, the parents are the regulators, basically. So basically, the sandbox is a test bed for trying out new things. And it has been done actually in many fields. So in the financial regulation, in energy regulation, in healthcare, even like in the legal profession. So Arizona has had a regulatory sandbox on the legal profession, for example. So it has been done across different sectors. Nowadays, the European Commission has actually is promoting nowadays with the AI Act sandboxes in AI. So drawing on the AI Act, basically, according to the AI Act, there will be the possibility, actually the obligation for national authorities to actually come up with sandboxes. And the sandboxes have, of course, to be made under the supervision of regulators. You have to manage the risks, identify the risk and manage the risks. You cannot actually put at stake fundamental rights, health and safety, of course. And the idea is that just because you participate in the sandbox does not mean you can actually exempt, fail to comply with the rules, but you basically are protected from fines or infringements of the AI Act as long as you are in good faith. So this is basically what the sandbox is. The sandbox has a lot of rules in that sense. You have to actually try out something new in the sandbox for a certain period. And the idea is that you actually get additional compliance help from the authority that is regulating you. So imagine that you want to actually come up with a new sandbox on, for example, you want to come up with a better smartwatch. For example, you want to come up with a new better smartwatch, and you're a small, medium enterprise or a startup. You can join your national sandbox, and basically, the issue is that you think that your product is a low-risk AI, and you think there's not going to be any problems in terms of ethics or privacy, but you would like to get extra help to assess the issue. And then you can join the sandbox. Imagine it's a sandbox on medical devices or wearables, and then you can actually try it out, and the regulator will actually ask you to do follow a sandbox plan. And in sandbox plan, you have to actually say what you're going to test, for how long, who are you going to test it with, if there is any risk for certain rules of the AI Act or GDPR. And then they basically should help you to actually develop the plan and test it out. That is basically more or less how it should work. It is basically a controlled environment, and basically has to follow a very specific plan. So in a way, you can actually see it's quite similar to the idea of playing in a sandbox. There are nowadays they're still developing the sandboxes, so there's not a lot of experience with the AI sandbox in particular, but this is something that's growing by the day. So in Bologna, for example, they are working on a number of sandboxes now, and this is something that you can, if you actually check on different websites, you find a lot of information. The objectives of the sandboxes are basically to improve legal certainty in the compliance with the AI Act, to actually promote best practices, to promote innovation, of course, and to also promote mostly evidence-based learning. Another element that is quite important is that if you actually have tested something beforehand under the supervision of a regulator, you can also ensure that a new product can enter the market faster. And this is something that is important because in the European Union, sometimes it takes a long time for actually products to enter the market because they have to pass all kinds of verifications. So if you have participated in the AI Act, this is a way, in the AI sandbox, this is a way of accelerating the process. So this is basically like, these are like the key objectives, the key elements in terms of rules, but it's not the only, innovation-friendly measure that the AI Act has, suggested. There are also other experimental approaches there are other experiments with high risk, AI things, AI, technologies that you can actually do. And there are also like some other kinds of like testing and experimental facilities that have been created by the European Commission. Especially in the agricultural sector, in healthcare, in manufacturing, and smart cities. So basically, these are projects that have been created in parallel to the sandboxes, and the idea is to actually create more experimentation, more experimental governance, and to actually boost European competitiveness. So what do we take away from this? Because I've been talking for a long time. So basically, when we regulate technology, when you regulate the future, there are many approaches that we can actually take. We can do like the traditional Adam Smith kind of, idea that we wait and see. We wait to see if the market will, solve it itself. The history has told us it doesn't really work. So I guess nobody really wants this anymore. Even though, I mean, for example, like nowadays, you hear all tech companies complain about everything, about technology, but these tech companies, they were asking the European Commission to regulate, like, just a few years ago. So like, Elon Musk was, super obsessed with regulating AI for a long time. And now he has changed his mind, but he was actually like worried about it. So basically, wait and see. It's not really an approach that we actually like, want to embrace, because it has not, like, history has told us it doesn't work. So basically what we actually, like have seen more recently is actually the ability to customize and guide companies as a way of actually promoting regulation in a more collaborative way, in a way in which basically actors and regulation can come together. And especially if we have different kinds of stakeholders that represent basically different interests, also like communities that are affected negatively by technology, we could actually have a system where technological regulation is more equal and especially more equitable. And this is something that where regulation in general has failed quite a lot. We have, of course, the element of experimentation and derogation. The AI Act does not allow for derogation of norms, for example. But basically, it's it's within like the experimentalist governance to say, well, in some cases we don't apply certain rules. We focus on the experimental learning, and basically this idea of like learning and working together is probably a way to actually regulate the future. What we do know from the past is that regulation is very cyclical. So even now we are facing a moment of history where people are trying to deregulate us more, where they're trying to resist regulation. This will probably end at some point, and then we'll have a moment of re-regulation. Unfortunately, this usually happens when there is a war or a global financial crisis. It's not great for us, but it's very often cyclical. What is important, I think, is to use this moment to actually invest in experiments and collaborations with different actors, and also to try to keep understanding how technology works and how basically technology can be a source of inequality, can be something that has a lot of advantages for some, but it can also produce a lot of inequities for others. So in that sense, regulating the future is a very profound question, as ChatGPT said. But I think it is important to keep investing in understanding each other and focusing on, promoting regulation that is, transparent, collaborative, and definitely that promotes accountability. But, ultimately, regulation is, of course, a process that, requires some special powers, but hopefully our special power, or your special power as a future regulators, future lawyers of the world, will be to actually try to make our world a little bit better, and try to understand how we actually can regulate technology for everybody. Thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you so much, Sofia, for this very, for this terrific actually talk. When we thought about this opening lecture, we thought also of complementing the main speaker with a panel of discussants, bringing in diverse experience, different perspectives from different disciplinary fields. And so I would like to invite to join us Giuseppe Bellantuono, Sondra Faccio, and Simone Penasa. Giuseppe Bellantuono is they are professor here at the law school in Trento. Giuseppe Bellantuono is a comparative private law professor. Sondra Faccio is an international lawyer, even though, if I'm not wrong, you have also a PhD in law and economics of enterprises. So, you know, combining different different fields also in this area. And Simone is a comparative constitutional lawyer. So we have international law, private law, and public law combining together in order to have, you know, some notes and comments to Professor Ranchordás talk. Giuseppe, would you like to start?
Thanks a lot, Carlo, and thanks a lot again, Professor Ranchordás, for this really insightful presentation. We already had this morning a very lively discussion about your book, Introduction to Law and Regulation, and also your second book about structural inequalities with case studies from Italy. And so we could not hope in a better start for this global lawmaking program, because the topics that you touched upon even quickly are really the topics that we hope our students in these 2 years will learn about in more depth. Meaning that when we started planning for this master program, global lawmaking, and Carlo can testify this, the idea was, of course, to provide a formal education in legal matters, helping our students also to work in international environments. But at the same time, there were two big areas in which we hoped to invest more, because these are two research areas for our Faculty of Law here in Trento, that is the digital transition and the ecological transition. And the two, of course, can be can also generate synergies, and they are also called the twin transition in the EU language, in the language of the EU policymakers. Now, this means that in practice, we are asking our students to really focus on learning how to regulate the future, which is exactly the topic of your presentation. That is, it is clear that the temporal dimension is extremely important for these big transitions, this big transformation that we are undergoing in our age. And this, of course, raises a lot of complex issues, not only from a legal point of view, but from many other different points of view. Now, it is clear that when we talk about regulating the future, it means that we give central stage to the temporal dimension, and of course, the law usually as an important temporal dimension, given that, of course, any new legal rule is aimed at regulating the future in some sense. But here we are talking about even more difficult to manage, that is, how to face the uncertainty about the future, and probably we are also entering an age in which so-called long-term problems are becoming more and more pressing. There was a recent book, for example, by political scientist Thomas Hale from Oxford, and the title of the book, published by Princeton University Press, is exactly this: Long Problems. And the main argument of the book is exactly that we are the first society having to face many, many more long problems, that is, problems that project their efforts in a very far distant future than was true in the past. And there are other literatures, also non-legal literatures that we can refer. For example, there are interesting studies made again in political science by Holger Strassheim from Bielefeld University, and he wrote about the governance of time and the governance by time, making a distinction in order to point out that whenever we try to introduce the temporal dimension in the regulatory process, clearly we are to some extent building a new future. And indeed, he talks about so-called timescapes. That is, it is clear that we are choosing which future is more likely or which future we prefer. And clearly, we are also building scenarios in order to make sure that we can identify the pathway, which is a legal pathway, but also a political pathway and an economic pathway to reach the future that we like or that we would like to implement at some point in time. So clearly, this means that lawyers are deeply involved in building these future scenarios, even though they don't use all the tools that social scientists, for example, use in order to identify the components of these scenarios. And there is an area of studies which is directly involved, specifically involved in scenario planning. But at the same time, it is clear that there is a role to be played by legal scholars and also more generally by lawyers working in many different sectors. In private practice sometimes, because clearly we are also talking about planning processes involving organizations. So maybe working as a consultant or an in-house counsel for an organization, for a private organization, also means to learn how to anticipate future dynamics. And the point is this, I think, a point that clearly emerges also from this presentation by Professor Ranchordás. Regulating the future involves, to a large extent, to understand what could be the development of legal dynamics, meaning that clearly we know very well that any kind of legal change is deeply intertwined with changes happening in many different spheres. But at the same time, we can see that there is some kind of autonomy also in legal dynamics. So we cannot simply say that because we have the need, for example, to increase the competitiveness of the economy, then we have to choose a specific legal intervention, or we have to change the law in order to support economic competitiveness. And indeed, when the Draghi report is advertised in this way, to find a way to put Europe on a new pathway, well, clearly here we can see some frictions between what is the economic perspective and what is the regulatory perspective. So we can see many different dynamics at play, and this is clearly what is important in order to shape the future, in order to understand, first of all, what are the goals that we want to pursue. And my impression, and this is the general question that I would like to submit also for our debate with Professor Ranchordás, is this. Can we really adopt just a technical or technocratic approach to regulating the future, meaning that is the goal simply to fine-tune some specific legal tools? And one example is, of course, the regulatory sandboxes, in order to do a good job as lawyers. So is this just the only task that we ask from a good lawyer involved in this kind of experimental regulation, paying attention to the details, for example, of how to share information from the regulatory sandboxes, or how to avoid taking excessive risks from these experiments? and also deciding who is liable in case someone is damaged while carrying out these experimental processes, or is there something more normative? Are there normative goals that we shall try to inject in these kind of experimental approaches, and what these normative goals should be? Of course, we could refer, for example, to intergenerational justice, very important, but also very difficult to manage, simply because it raises a lot of issues from the point of view of democratic processes, and also from the point of view of political process, and also philosophical point of view. We could also refer, of course, we want, for example, sustainable development. Is it a goal that we want to pursue? Well, it depends on who you are. For example, if you ask some African people or Latin American people, they could tell you that they don't like sustainable development because they believe that it is a Western concept. And they like development, but a different type of development. So also from this point of view, I think that maybe we should try to develop an approach to this kind of experimental governance, which is descriptive, explanatory, but also prescriptive and normative. So we should put on the table all the normative issues that regulating the future necessarily entails. And this is clearly a conversation that we need to have among researchers from very different fields, but also it is important that it is something that we include in our teaching activities, simply because otherwise it seems that we are just technicians that try to fix some problems. But the very important issue is, what is the problem that we want to fix in the first place? And so when we talk about regulating the future, we don't know exactly what the problem is. We have to identify the problem, or we have to agree in some way, find some way to agree on what the problem is. Otherwise, well, we could have a dominant narrative, which, however, is only offers a partial point of view and is not really inclusive of many different issues that are important for different groups. Maybe they are also minorities. Thank you.
Thank you, Giuseppe. Sondra?
Okay. So first of all, let me thank for the kind invitation. It's a pleasure to be here at the lunch of GLaM. And I thank you, Professor Ranchordás, for her nice introduction and interesting speech. I also did my homework, I read your article on sandboxes to be prepared for today, and try to find some connection with the international field. That is what I'm dealing with in my daily work, I would say, and international economic law, or investment law more specifically. But before doing that, I would like to make some remark on the general trend that you illustrated very well on cycles of regulation, deregulation. In my view, we are in a cycle, or starting a cycle of deregulation, also referring to the Draghi report that has been mentioned several times now. The Draghi report is suggesting for the issue to achieve competitiveness, to deregulate some important piece of legislation also of the European Union. I'm just mentioning the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive, for example, that was somehow deregulated with the omnibus package within the European Union. But it's also a trend that can be witnessed in the international law field. The international law is in crisis in general. I'm looking to the events that are taking place recently. But what we have witnessed is a crisis, for example, of the multilateralism, the multilateral system that helped to build some of the most important regulatory instruments that we have in the international field, including, for example, the World Trade Organization and all the regulation of tariffs and the relationship between states in this regard. We now exclusive bilateral relationship between states. And we all know about that because it was on newspapers very recently. The crisis of multilateralism, so old-fashioned regulatory tools or ways, is in general knows some exceptions, by the way, and I will start from this exception to bring some examples of what has been called innovative regulation experiment, as the sandboxes have been illustrated, to illustrate a few examples that are relevant in the international field on how states, and not only states, but also other actors, including scholars, professionals, companies, are trying to shape certain rules of international law for the future. Among these, I will take the first example from a concrete experience that I'm doing, but also other colleagues are doing with the School of International Studies, that is observer member of Working Group 3 at the UNCITRAL Commission, so Commission on International Commerce at the United Nations, where Working Group 3 is working on the reform of investment law, international investment arbitration more specifically, which is old-fashioned tools of international law. I wouldn't say one of the oldest, but kind of. And despite the crisis of multilateralism, this is a multilateral forum where many states are discussing how to, many states are represented from all around the world. So also what we define least developed countries, developing countries, Western or developed countries, and they're trying to discuss and bring forward reforms to this very old framework of international law. And what is interesting, and here I'm taking borrowing from the article, but also some keywords that emerge today, identifying what are sandboxes as a experimental regulatory tool, if I can use this wording to define it, is let's say is a closed environment where not only states, so the main addressees and masters of these rules, but also other stakeholders in a collaborative way are coming up with ideas of how to reform the process. So it has this collaborative aspect I was discussed about sandboxes, has specific objectives, very well defined by the UNCITRAL mandate, meaning reforming investment arbitration and proposing some specific reforms in relation to how arbitration shall be performed in this field. So a given mandate, there are entry and exit criteria, very strict, by the way. To be admitted, you have a long process of application, and you have to represent an interest which is worthwhile to be represented within the forum. And you don't have geographical limitation as sandboxes, for example, nor and you have a limited duration, by the way, similarly to sandboxes. What is interesting in this, I think, concerning this experiment of in the international law field, is that exactly the collaborative tool, so the involvement of many other actors, including a university such as the School of International Studies that is part of the University of Trento, but also companies representatives and other association representatives that have the right of word to express their position during the meetings, as well as states. You can take the floor as any other state, even though you will not be addressee of the rules in the end, because these rules will apply to states. And then the fact that all states are presenting their point of view, including least developed countries, with a very different perspective on how the law should be in the future, and with a special attention on aspects, for example, of sustainability and public interest. So this is the first example I would like to bring, which in my view also brings a little bit of hope for in the sense that at least is a sign of that is in contrast with the crisis of the multilateralism. We don't know what would be the output, probably even could be nothing in the end, but at least there's an organization that is working, a working group within an international organization that is working in a multilateral way in a very important economic aspect. Probably I forgot to give a few basic information about what's international investment arbitration. I think is an important aspect in international economic field because basically it deals with the regulation of such companies that multinational companies that invest abroad, often in the mining sector, for example, but in many other sectors. So when a domestic company goes abroad and invests in another country, creates an economic activity in another country, and how these company is treated and regulated by the host state of the economic activity in light of some basic rules of international law. Let's say that international law provide for certain basic standards of treatment of these companies. And the most important protection it grants is the right of the company to bring a claim directly against the host states once the host states violate such international law standards that are set by treaties. I hope it's clear, even though, but just to say that it's a relevant topic because it concerns the activities of big companies around the world. The companies that we know, we have mentioned Shell. Shell is an interesting example because it makes foreign direct investments around the world. Another example that I would like to mention, which has exactly the same features of regulatory sandboxes, are special economic zones. These are not a product of international law, but has relevance for international economic relations, are usually set up by states, are geographically limited area within a country where where states implement, let's say, a flexible and favorable economic and regulatory environment to attract investments from abroad. So the multinational companies that I was mentioning, to invest in the host states and hopefully create spillovers and stimulate economic development domestically. These special economic zones have exactly all the essential features that have been described for the regulatory sandboxes. So a limited duration usually are geographically limited. They have entry and exit criteria. They usually provide for derogation to certain regulatory aspects, let's say. They have precise purposes. So, for example, developing, I don't know, high-tech economic activities or specific industrial activities. And they feature, again, some collaborative form of collaboration with local corporations or local actors in this case. Here, an example of special economic zone that exists in Italy, that exists in Turkey, for example. But what I found very, very interesting is that these special economic zones that are used as experiment to try to find let's say, the perfect economic and regulatory mix to help economic development in certain countries are also used as a tool to experiment how to increase sustainable development, how to promote sustainable development. There's a recent report published by the UNCTAD, that is an agency within the United Nations that deals with economic aspects, that collect information from more than 50 special economic zones that involves many different countries, including African countries, Latin American countries, not only Western countries, I would say, that have united their energy, let's say, to elaborate these projects where sustainability, special economic zones are used as sustainability experiment to try to develop some regulatory provision or some deregulation provision to help reaching certain sustainability goals. I thought this is an interesting aspect because it connects nicely also to what Professor Bellantuono said concerning the normative aspects, and it will add the value. So I was wondering that I'm concluding with a comment that is also a question: what will be the role of values, if I can use this term, in regulating the future, which is something similar to what Professor Bellantuono said when he mentioned the normative aspects and, for example, intergenerational justice, sustainable development, as in this special economic zone, in this project. I was wondering And I hope values will have a place. And I was wondering what my colleagues and especially our guest speaker today think about that. Thank you.
Thank you. And values are, of course, important in a constitutional perspective, for instance. So this brings me to give the floor to Simone Penasa, who is a comparative constitutional lawyer.
Okay, thank you very much, and thank you for inviting me, because I'm even more happy because I'm read the Professor Ranchordás and quote Professor Ranchordás so much that finally we are here to discuss together. So I'm very happy to have this chance. So one may argue that we are talking about nothing new. No, we already saw it and understood it, because of course it's something that could sound obvious. Technology evolves, interest surrounding the technological innovation evolves and get more complicated and escalating. So regulatory strategies and regulatory tools needs to evolve and adapt to, of course, behind them there's also the evolution or the evolution of the political and financial agenda behind the regulatory strategy. So traditionally, the law regulation needs to stay connected or tuned to the regulatory target. And of course, this is always more complicated when we are facing so fast innovation of technology, especially in the field of artificial intelligence. So it's not a new challenge. Probably what's new is the context. You mentioned, of course, a shift of paradigm, which is not only quantitative, numbers, is also qualitative. For instance, stakes. So if we are experiences, as I believe we are experiences, a qualitative shift of paradigm facing, for instance, the AI, generative AI, I think the most interesting issue to study, to analyze also for you students, is the method of the regulation. Not only, but they are key, but the concrete strategies, the tools, the values we want to protect and develop through technology, not only against technology, but also through technology. But I think it's especially key the methods of the regulatory process and of the regulation. So I like the question of Professor Bellantuono is a simple adjustment enough, the regulatory sandbox. I'm really fascinated about this experimental and anticipatory regulation. I think I trust in it, but I think this kind of tools, this kind of strategies needs to be inserted in a more global and complex also context. So I like for instance, I don't know, can we, because it was at the time equally disruptive, can we compare an X-ray machine in the 50s with predictive diagnostic algorithms nowadays in terms of impact of not only in the efficiency, in the timing of the healthcare service providing, but also in a more comprehensive terms from the perspective on how the entire healthcare system is conceived, organized, planned, but also financed and accessed. Do they have the same impact in terms of patient-doctor relationships, or in terms of patient rights? Someone starts to refer, also in this room, to a right, a fundamental right to the AI. Also in the healthcare, so of course, there's also a right to an X-ray, but the scale probably is something different because the pros and cons, the risk posed by a predictive algorithm in the healthcare systems are very different from the traditional one. The old one is not just a matter of, as you already mentioned, but I think this is one of the key also to understand the vision, the perspective of the AI Act, for instance. It's not just a matter of safety of a product. Of course, in this case, even if a predictive algorithm works well, properly in technological terms, in mathematical terms, at the same time, it could be unequal and unfair in societal, ethical, and legal terms. So the same understanding, the same content of the concept of risks and safety is changing, already changed in my understanding. So, and in this perspective, it's not only a matter of technical safety, but it's also a matter of ethical, social, and legal, constitutional safety and fairness of this tool. So so I really like the idea on which I'm working on of the image of immersion, a mutual immersion between the law, regulation on the one side and the technology on the other side. I think one of the challenges for the regulators, but also for society as a whole, is to find a way, and I think that regulatory sandboxes, but also the algorithm, fundamental rights impact assessment in the context of artificial intelligence may be very useful in this direction, but the aim must be to find a way to, and I think this, the traditional law of the parliament, it's not enough. I don't know, this is another big question for you. If there's still any room for this kind of old-fashioned regulatory and legislative tools, and if any, which kind of design and content of this kind of old-fashioned tools. But probably I'm sure we need other tools. The command and control approach is not working. You can prohibit the use, but then who cares? No, if a judge can in his office have an immediate access to ChatGPT or any other kind of generative artificial intelligence. So this is an issue of the method, not only the method of the regulation, but also a method of the design and the production of the technology. So this is the idea of a mutual immersion. So the challenge, and I think you can find some tool also at the cultural level. I refers to the call for the literacy principle in the AI Act, the idea to represent, reproduce within the research team to the complexity and the diversity of the society in terms of gender, culture, and also background and expertise. So this mutual immersion needs to lead to integrating into the technological dimension, the legal and ethical one, and vice versa. So we need to adapt, design, and integrate the traditional regulatory tools and concept to the new technological context, and vice versa. Think about the data and algorithms and artificial intelligence. I think it's very clear that it's not just and only it is also, but not only and not just a matter of privacy or data control. If you, from a regulatory perspective, if you have to put some principles, a requirement to the data governance, you have also to think about the representativeness, the accuracy, the comprehensiveness of the data in terms of how the society is expressed by that data. Is not only a matter of privacy, it's a matter of also of equality, discrimination, possible discrimination, reliability, and social trust in the tool. So addressing and coping with this kind of challenge, which is not only the future, but it's still it's present. Is this day is happening this day. We need a shift of paradigm of also from the regulatory perspective, and from a comparative perspective, we start to have some very useful example. I'm not so negative with regard to the AI Act because I see at least an attempt to provide for new tools, new approaches, new perspective to watch and consider the intertwining between technology and society. And I think, of course, regulatory sandboxes can be one of those. The thing is that the other thing, and this is another variable I want to ask your opinion on, is that AI Act, as well as many other regulatory tools, especially at the international global level, refers and based and grounds mainly on the self-assessment and a kind of more or less discretionary enforcement of the regulatory tool by the deployers and by the producer. And this could be, of course, a huge and a big challenge, especially you think about the use of this kind of technology by the public administration for exercising public services and public function. And last thing, I have just two questions. The first one, what could be the label for the last in the regulatory timeline was the regulation, re-regulation, but you didn't put any label on the last, the AI and generative AI ones and forward. So I was wondering which kind of label we can insert then. And then actually probably the old or traditional law could have a role and a function, and I refer to the international law. When you were referring to, which is one of the more pressing challenges of the regulation will be or is the equal distribution of technology. I was recalling the old-fashioned right to science, at the international level, which is the right to benefit from scientific advancement and to participate in the scientific enterprises, which of course it's very difficult to activate, but I think it could have a role also when facing artificial intelligence and new dimension of innovation technology. Thank you.
Okay, thank you, Simone. Before giving the floor to Professor Ranchordás back for her concluding remarks, let me ask if there are any questions, comments, remarks from the audience. Yeah, it's better if you can come here because we are recording the meeting, so.
No, just also to me, and I have to say that I'm quite impressed also by the ChatGPT answer, because it's one of the very few I've seen which is actually useful and also covering many aspects of the topic. I'm a bit surprised by this emphasis on cooperation as a precondition, which I personally very much agree with and like. But we had a lot of discussions these days at the School of International Studies, and also there was the Trump speech, there was Josep Borrell here, and we were talking about everything else than cooperation. So where does this optimism come from that cooperation actually will be there in a sufficient quantity and in order to permit these cooperation? The second point I'd like to make is long problems. I want to jump on this. Is this sandbox idea something which in a way restores what in the past have been kind of regional innovations? So you had in some regions of the world you were experimenting something and to in the sense that today this is not possible because these innovations we are talking about are immediately having a global scale and also immediate effects everywhere. And so in a way to restore this idea which in the past was simply geographically done. And the third question is I don't know whether actually it fits, but I'm asking anyway, because you mentioned the Draghi report. There was also the Letta report, and the Letta report had a nice suggestion, which was to introduce a 28th legal system in the EU for permitting investment. So this is also a kind of regulation. So in order to, in a way, detach this 28th legal system, as far as I've understood, from the 27 potentially different implementations in the countries. In a way, is this the opposite end, or is this also something, anyway, it's regulation, so thanks.
Jens Wulk, Professor of Comparative Constitutional Law here at the Law School. If there are no any other comments or questions, yeah, sure. If you
Thanks, everybody, for the presentation. It was great. And I think the sandbox idea is very cool. I've spent a number of years in the US working in the environmental regulatory space. And one of the chief complaints is that the regulators, one, don't know how to regulate, and two, don't know anything about the businesses that they're regulating. They've spent no time actually participating there. They've gone straight into regulating, and so maybe they learn how to draft things, but they don't actually know what they're regulating. And so a lot of what comes out of it is nonsensical regulations that they want things that can't be done, or they miss opportunities to regulate things that could be actually changed. So the question that I have is, how do you use these sandboxes to drive innovation that also applies to the major companies like Exxon and Shell? If you're going to have, a small company that's going to try to create some sort of emission capture technology, how do you then make that benefit apply to everybody? Thank you.
Thanks a lot. Great question. Okay.
Last chance.
Okay, so time for
Okay.
remarks.
If I may, I'll start with your question. Because actually, like in the morning session, I actually talked about this. I was actually telling the story that when I worked as a lawyer, like on a cartel, like basically like on a food cartel, like a canteen cartel, my boss told me, in order to be a good competition lawyer, you need to know the field. So in order to know where somebody like is agreeing on prices, is engaging a cartel, you need to know what makes the market tick. Like you need to know whether like a prison is going to actually like hire somebody like, that has a specific menu, or why is it like, is the price more important or is the nutritional content more important? So basically, like, I got to know a lot about canteens, actually, about catering, but this is valid for everything. So for example, now there is, I always like when I teach regulation, I always tell my students to watch the Netflix series Rotten, because when you watch Rotten, actually you get to know how the field works, and these are all regulated sectors. So for example, there is one episode on coffee, on chocolate, on IKEA furniture, and and the thing is, if you get to know how think of wine, and this helps you actually know what are the risks of the field and what you have to address. And the problem is that with the New Deal, all these agencies, independent agencies, they were created based on the idea that these people had expertise, had legitimacy because they were experts. But from the moment the science has become so complex, and the regulators are no longer experts, they just have no legitimacy. And this is something that we really, really see, that in highly complex fields, like I would say mostly, like for example, like in the US EPA and FDA, they really struggle a lot. Because for example, like if you see, there is another, I basically like encourage my students to watch a lot of Netflix because they are really good documentaries on regulated sectors. So there is one on Oxycontin, which the American students know what Oxycontin is. The Europeans might not know. Oxycontin is an extremely addictive drug that you usually take when you do massive surgery. And it's basically heroin that is legal. And basically what is interesting in this, in this series is that they actually talk about the regulatory process, and they show how basically the company behind Oxycontin, they understood that the FDA did not have the resources to conduct their own testing. So basically what they ask, and this comes back to Simone's question, they ask, the company to provide their self-assessments, their tests, and then they actually just check them for procedure. But the issue is that the company has a huge incentive, like definitely did in Oxycontin, to actually lie, because even if they get sued, it's how they thought, they were making so much money that is worth it. It was worth it to lie, basically. And this is something we actually see, that regulators sometimes they don't invest enough in making sure that their people continue to be experts. And this is something that we also will see now with AI. So with AI, all national authorities need to agree on who's going to implement the AI Act and everything. And this is going to be a challenge for sure. On your question, how to use sandboxes to drive innovation and how it will apply to large companies, this is like a big issue, because when you read sandbox regulations, the target of sandboxes are small companies. There is this idea that if you're a big company, you should not participate in a sandbox. But you know what happens in behind the scenes is that, for example, Meta, what they have been lobbying a lot for experiments at the OECD level and also at the European Commission level. Why? Because they basically invest on all these small companies. They let them go into the sandbox, see who fails and who makes it, and then they buy them. This is exactly how it works. So basically, in a way, even though they will not benefit directly, there is a scheme that they do, and you see it. So indirectly, this happens, because the thing is, this is like just market functioning. It's not even the regulation. So the regulators are not really taking into this account. So I do think that there is this assumption that if you are a very big company like Exxon or or Meta, whatever, you don't need a sandbox, because a sandbox is something that you actually need when you don't have a big compliance department. And then you need to have an additional help. So as a big company, you don't deserve sandboxing. But maybe you do, because the thing is, if you're trying to bring into the market a product that is high risk, maybe being guided by the regulator would not be a bad idea. So I think there should be actually sandboxes for big tech, for big companies, because this will be a way of actually ensuring that there is more guidance into the regulatory process. So, but this is, as you correctly noted, this is definitely a gap in regulatory sandboxes.
May I jump?
Yeah.
Do you think also that the results of the sandbox can be useful for regulator to change the law? in order,
Well, experimental regulations
Yeah.
have been been used for this purpose. So, I mean, I did my PhD on experimental regulations back when nobody cared about experimental regulations. So, I mean, I'm very acquainted with traditional experiments, like the regional experiments, which were actually something that at international, like it was actually done in the context of like formal empires. So, for example, the British Empire had experimental zones. They had experimental regions for tax purposes, for example. So the British Empire had that. So, so like Punjab was an experimental region, for example, for the British Empire. And special economic zones have been used for a long time. I'm very glad you mentioned this example. And they have been studied. The difference between like special economic zones, regionals, regions that are used and other forms of experimental, like traditional experimental regulations, is that basically a sandbox is a much smaller environment, and it may not always lead to any changes in the sense that while all these experimental regulations and special economic zones, they are basically like you're trying to learn and you're trying to either like derogate the law. Usually it's focused on derogation. All of them is like very focused on derogation. So you say, okay, to these people we do not apply the law. And now with the modern version of regulatory sandboxes, there are different models. There is a model, like the financial model, for example, is one where you actually derogate the law in the financial regulation, in financial sandboxes. The AI model is that you do not derogate. You actually just help with compliance, you customize, and you're mostly trying to like accompany the innovation process. So it is a more controlled environment than actually all the other environments that we have seen for traditional experiments. So in traditional experiments, we have seen, we have seen different like typologies, and many of them have led to like the changes of legislation. I hope that regulatory sandboxes will also, lead to such a thing. But when you read the AI Act, it's not clear that they actually want to do it. It's not clear that this is the goal. While in experimental legislation and regulations mostly, this can be the goal. And in fact, many experiments in France have led actually even the modification of the constitution. The French constitution allows for two types of experimental regulations, one at national level and one at local level. So what you mentioned. So then each region, and maybe each region actually read Corsica, because Corsica was the one who was always wanted to do something different, obviously, because they had in the past independency claims. So Corsica, they were always like fighting with with Council of States. So they wanted to have their own schools. They wanted to like be able to like have also like the language policy, and then they experimented themselves. Then the French Constitution decided, the French decided to change Constitution, allowing for a system for experiments. And in France, in fact, you have a lot of experimental regulations that lead to the change of legislation. So the idea is we experiment for 5 years, and if the results are positive, we change the legislation after this period. Or basically, we just go back to how it was. It doesn't always work very well, but the French have this model. In policy making, we also see this model sometimes as in the US, but mostly like state as laboratories dynamic is a bit different, more public policy dimension, and usually like the influence of who actually like influences who usually depends on what state experiment. So actually what you mentioned, like California and New York are usually the states that when they experiment with something, they usually are able to convince others to change. If a small state experiments, that does always mean that the others will look at them as an example. So this is like public political science and public policy research, but there is some work on this actually. Okay, so now I will go back to the first questions. I took note of the books that you mentioned. I will definitely read them. And the first question you asked was, can we only adopt a technocratic approach to the regulation of future? And, what about the normative? And this actually connects very well to other questions, namely the one on the point of values, so like what kind of values do we take into account? And this is really important because the thing is, if we don't regulate on a value-based foundation, you basically are regulating AI and you regulate the future the same way we regulate toys, right? And of course, Lego is regulated in a certain way. So when I was playing with Lego, Lego was very small. And probably when some of you play with Lego, if you have kids now, you probably see that Lego, the size of a Lego piece has increased, right? Why is that? Choking, right? Because kids were choking on Legos. I mean, I never choked, but probably other kids my age choked on Legos. And this is something that it's kind of like straightforward in the sense that, okay, you measure the size of the Lego and you increase it because, you know, it's like a safety element. And of course, safety is a value in a way. It is one value. But in order to regulate the future, of course, you need to have a broader sense of values. There is a big discussion nowadays in literature on public values, on the use of public values to regulate technology. For example, I've written on, for example, the role of empathy as a public value. And I basically have suggested that empathy and I mean, as also solidarity should be one of the values that we should introduce in the normative frameworks to regulate technology. Because if you don't consider empathy and solidarity in regulation, you're basically only focusing on technocratic perspective of the regulation, but you're not focusing on the human dimension of regulation. So I also agree with you that technocratic regulation is actually very limited, and we know from actually like history that technocratic regulation usually fails, and at times of populism, it's attacked. There is a lot of distrust of technocracy right now, and it has been actually since the global financial crisis. So I think I think technocratic regulation are not going to take us anywhere, because it has brought us to where we are now in a world of backsliding of the rule of law, of populism. So I think it's important to actually have a more like democratic approach where we rely on experts, but we also rely on a broader inclusion of society. So what Simona was mentioning, that we need to actually address also the element of diversity. Who is actually representing people? Is everybody representing here? Is everybody represented? Everybody's they're going to use technology and benefit from technology. Also, the element of the cries of multilateralism. This is a really important element, because basically when we are for example in my field, I'm from administrative law. For a long time, we talked about global administrative law and the importance of actually having multilateral networks. And this is something that unfortunately is failing, because we find ourselves in a situation where there is a growth of protectionism and closing of global doors of regulation. And this is quite important in the area of global value chain and supply chain regulation. There is it has become really difficult to actually tackle these elements. So this is actually a huge issue. On the special economic zones, I think this is also interesting, because even countries like China, they have special economic zones. Like Macau is a special economic zone. I would say not for the best purposes, because actually they have special economic zone for tax evasion and gambling, right? So I don't know if they have
Many special economic, so I can understand that there are also two types of.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, there are good ones. I mean, where I come from in Portugal, actually, there is we have also Madeira. So they also have a special economic zone. But actually, so there are different types. So for example, in the Netherlands, when I did a PhD, I actually did a study of the different special economic zones in the Netherlands. And at the time, there were many. There were some for safety, others for innovation, technology. There were different ones. In Belgium, they call it it's very funny, they have a very funny name for special economic zones. They call it rule-free zones.
Yes, there are different names.
There's different types, yeah.
Add something on
Yeah.
that, because you said that special economic zone usually are for deregulation, or at least they are focused on the regulation. That's true for a certain point of view. I mean, for example, in relation to tax levies or custom duties or things like this. On the other hand, I tried to check the few special economic zone. I was able to check for this event today, and try to check whether there's the regulation in relation to environmental standards, for example, or social standards. And what I notice is, at least for example, the case of Turkey and Italy, there's no deregulation in this case, but on the contrary, the law says exactly that all labor laws, social assistance laws, and
Is this the context of Sperimentazione Italia?
No, it's a law, it's a decree for Italy
Okay.
that dates back a few years ago, and I can tell you the name. But basically, it was stating that the environmental standards shall be respected, as in the mainland, let's say. So probably the regulation of these aspects is not anymore an issue, but perhaps it was in the past.
Yeah.
I'm not saying it was not in the past.
Yeah, exactly. I know that there were many different ones. So this is actually like, you know, because the thing is, so like within the experimental world, there are just so many different kinds of types of regulation. And one of the things that Simona raised, and it's very important, and I've written a lot about it, is the method. So in order for regulation to actually regulatory sandboxes to work, they have to actually follow a good method. Because just like an experiment, I mean, like here there are many people who do bioethics. Why were experiments so poorly regarded? Because the experiments were done for the worst purposes ever. So because of that, method really matters. And I think, you know, defining a good sandbox plan or a good methodology for sandboxes is what will determine whether they will succeed or fail in the long run. Whether we can compare the, you know, the effect of X-ray in the 1950s to the algorithms, in terms of disruptive innovation, I think it's very similar. The only difference is that I think, so in the 1950s, there was already the possibility to automate some data, so that already existed. And in fact, AI initially was not supposed to be called AI, but it was supposed to be called automated data. But then they thought it was not very cool, so they called it artificial intelligence because it was better. But I think the difference is that when it comes to X-ray, we still needed a person to actually like use his expert judgment to actually decide on it. While what we see, even nowadays, we still need a person to actually like, confirm what the algorithms have predicted. There are a lot of studies saying that we trust so much technology that we are actually extremely biased by what it tells us. And this is actually like complicated because X-ray was giving us a picture, while predictive algorithms give us a partial picture of the scenario, which they calculate, using different data. Which, if you don't have the right human interpreting this information, then of course mistakes can happen. Yet again, there are many radiologists who also make mistakes. So I think in this case, I think the difference is that the kind of bias that it gives us and the kind of like picture it gives us might always be an imperfect picture. And instead of actually like giving a picture of the human in front of it, it gives us more of a picture of what we think of as a society. It would be as saying that somebody who has a shorter leg is less worthy, while like an X-ray will not actually like make a value judgment over the person in front of it. And I think this is the difference between the X-ray and the algorithms in general. I already mentioned the element of self-assessment. That is, I personally think is complicated because when regulators rely on self-assessments, they of course spare resources, and I think this is part of it. But we also have a lot of scholarship also on standards, and that when you actually rely on self-assessments, you buy private standards, there are quite a lot of shortcomings that come out of this. So I think this also applies for the AI Act and in general, like self-regulation. So this is definitely an element. You asked me for the label for the last dot, and I left it open because in a way I actually I hope we go back to regulation again. But I can't predict the feature, so that's why I left it off, because I haven't still decided. I'm not sure if we will call it like Gen Reg. I still don't know. I still haven't thought about something smart to say about that aspect. I do think I'm even though I work on very innovative topics, I'm a very traditional public lawyer in a way. So I do believe in the strength of traditional constitutional and administrative elements and tools, because ultimately all this conversation is about who has the power and who gets to suffer the consequences of it, right? It's always about power dynamics. So when I teach administrative law, I always tell my students, administrative law regulates the exercise of power. And basically, like, we have the state and the citizen, and there's a power symmetry between the state and the citizen. And administrative law makes sure that this power symmetry is not abused. and that the state exercises the powers they have received from the parliament in the best way possible, in a way that is fair and is transparent. And I think ultimately it all comes down to this traditional elements. The only difference is that there are sectors. This is why I'm now working on research agenda more connected to structural inequalities, because traditionally we have accepted structural inequalities to exist. There are fields in which we have always had inequalities. Agriculture was always an area, a sector in which basically we have exploited people. We have always exploited agricultural workers. Feudalism. Feudalism was a structure of exploitation that we had for centuries, for a long time. What we did not have was, but also the things where we have feudalism in Europe, basically other continents have other structures. So for example, in Latin America, actually, like, they have quite a different perspective of nature, of like, they don't have this notion of exploiting nature as something being normal, because they actually believe that we should have mutual respect for nature, because nature is like one of us. So basically, this is why so many countries in Latin America have give legal personality to nature, or rivers, or trees, or parks, or whatever, because they feel that like nature is one of us in a way. So this comes from like a more indigenous, it's an indigenous perspective. So I think in a way there is something to learn from other countries where where there have been different perspectives, and I think in a way it is more important than ever to to collaborate, not in the way like proper international cooperation. That is probably, I don't have a lot of hope in that. But I think we should still continue to focus on collaboration. Sandboxes are mostly like national collaborations in any case. But I think we need to focus on values like solidarity, mutual respect, but also like understand that there have been structures of discrimination and extraction that have been there for a long time, and we'll need to actually talk about them in order to be able to actually reform them, because like agricultural work has been always like a structure of of inequality and extraction for like ever, and probably something to change. And also there are many others. So I think what we need to do is debunk many of these structures of exploitation to actually think of regulation as an exercise of equality rather than an exercise that actually keeps like making the rich richer. So in a sense, I'm not like appealing to Marxism, obviously. I'm far from a Marxist, but I think I'm appealing to mutual respect and solidarity. And I think this is something that sometimes we forget as lawyers. It's not part of our list of principles in a way. So I know I haven't responded to everything, but I think this is all I got for now.
Okay, let me conclude with two very short points. The first one is, regulating the future. In order to do that, we have to rethink about the law, to think about a future-proof law. So maybe in order to regulating the future, we have also to futuring the regulation. May I say that? The second point is, a big thanks to all the guys involved here. Let me thank also the Jean Monnet chair. I have the pleasure to hold. The name of the Jean Monnet chair is T4F, which stands for Training for Future. So, something like, very close to the topic we addressed today. And thank to everybody, to the discussant, and of course, thank you very much to Professor Sofia Ranchordás for her very, very, for your great speech. As I told you, it was not difficult to predict this future. That we could not have had a better inauguration. Thank you so much.